This film is very much an experiment, shot by Stuart Metcalf, a member of the VMCC and of the Vincent Club, in a lap of the Isle of Man circuit after the formal racing had been completed at the end of a very successful Manx fortnight. And here we see the winners of the various races on Senior Day receiving the acclaim that they deserve and the trophies that they deserve in equal measure. This is Roy Richardson in his Blackpool Football Club colours, a long-time supporter of the racing. And then we move on to the business of the day. As far as these young men were concerned, the VMCC lap of the full Isle of Man course from grandstand to grandstand. And there is Stuart, the filmmaker, Paul Langridge, his colleague on his Vincent Black Shadow, and lastly we have Bill Bewley on his Black Lightning replica, looking, I must say, rather apprehensive in the next shot. But there we are. We shall see how it goes. What we shall watch first is the film that I took from a standing position of the bikes assembling on the grid in the same way that the racing folk had done a couple of hours previously, and then leave the start line and disappear down the Glencrutchery Road, over St Ninian's Crossroads and down Bray Hill. The best of luck to all of them. After that you will see Stuart's film from his head cam, initially in the assembly area along the Glencrutchery Road, and then you'll see him emerge and come down and perform exactly the same routine as we're now watching on the screen. now back in the holding area, astride Stuart's bike, waiting in keen anticipation for the all clear to go out onto the circuit proper. Much twitching and turning and adjusting, wondering, but they will all soon know what it's like to approach the top of Bray Hill on a clear road. At last, we're off, past the scoreboard, approaching the overbridge just before the St Ninian crossroads, past the garage and the threshold of Bray Hill. And then down Bray Hill, fortunately without the requirement to stop at the traffic lights halfway down, over the crossroads, up and over Aggo's Leap, and then down towards Quarter Bridge. Round Quarter Bridge and then along the straight run towards Kirk Braddon Church and the bends there. First a left-hander and then a right-hander in front of the church. Left past the Joey Dunlop Memorial Building and then right in front of the church across the little roundabout, and then it's a straight run through Union Mills on smooth tarmac. Glenlough campsite and down into Glenvine itself. Past the church on the left, which is a very fine viewing point, but extremely fast. And this is the old Highlander pub on the right hand side, and then we were going forward towards Greba, and then in about half a minute's time through Greba Bridge. The next major landmark is the ex-pub at Ballacrane. We don't want anybody doing a George Formby and going in through the front door and coming out the back. But unfortunately it's no longer a public house these days. The bank bounding Ballig farm used to be a splendid viewing point, the long low wall on the left hand side, but unfortunately that's no longer an area where the public can go to view. We're now into the very tricky Laurel Bank section with substantial rock faces on the left hand side and a twisty road, and in about a minute's time we'll be through round the left hand bend at Glen Helen, where the pub is and the first of the on-course commentary points, and then up Craigwillis Hill past Sarah's Cottage and on to the extremely fast Cronkyvoddy Straight. So that's what's ahead of us. This is the corner at Glen Helen and the commentary box up on the right. And the Cronkyvoddy Straight is now ahead of us. We're now approaching the 11th milestone, which is a right and then a left-hand bend, and then 100 yards or so further down the road is a very substantial wall on the right-hand side representing Handley's Corner. When listening to commentary of the TT, etc., you very often hear reference to the top of Bagarrow. Well, there's the top of Bagarrow with a little chapel on the left-hand side, and then a steep descent and a right-hand bend at the bottom. Not for the faint-hearted. And that leads us on to the 13th milestone and a left-hand bend and into the village of Kirkmichael. And here we are approaching the Douglas Road corner, which takes us into Kirkmichael, and then the unique dash in racing terms through the narrow street of the village, which is normally protected by a 30-mile-an-hour speed camera. I guess some of these lads will be exceeding that. and then at the end of the village we see on the left hand side the garage, and just prior to that is Tony East's museum and Tony East's resident, Tony the architect, with his team of this splendid rally. Mention the TT course to any enthusiast and you'll very quickly be talking about Balaf Bridge, the location where the riders in the race situation leap the humpback bridge in the centre of the village. I suspect that some of our riders may attempt it, but the sensible ones will stay on terra firma and negotiate it without the risk of running into the bar of the Raven pub. We are now approaching the sweeping complex of bends known as quarry bends, which are adjacent to the wildlife park. And now the fastest point, certainly on the back of the circuit, the western side of the circuit, Sulby Straight, which leads us on to the right hand bend at Sulby Bridge, and then up a slight incline and left hand bend at Ginger Hall. Sulby Straight has a pub halfway along the Sulby Glen Hotel, which is a very popular vantage point for spectators. And Stuart very wisely slows down for the corner at the end of Sulby Straight, and then we pass Ginger Hall on the right hand side, the top of the slope. I admit to not being too familiar with the named sections of the course between Ginger Hall and Ramsey, so I will wait until we get to Schoolhouse Corner by Ramsey Grammar School on the approach to Parliament Square in Ramsey. Here we are passing Ramsey Grammar School on the right hand side. In fact, the school spans both sides of the road and there's a connecting overbridge, and then we come to a T-junction at the entrance to Parliament Square in Ramsey. Take a right turn there and through the centre of Ramsey, past the bus station, and then we start our climb to the Ramsey hairpin. This is effectively the start of the climb to the summit of the course. Round the hairpin, through the waterworks bends, and then the more acute right hand bend at the gooseneck. But I mustn't get ahead of myself. We've yet to reach Ramsey hairpin. We've still got to negotiate Mayhill, and then the hairpin will be ahead of us. This is not a bend that can be negotiated at speed, even with the whole of the road to play with. And Stuart sensibly takes the corner comfortably and accelerates towards the waterworks. That was the waterworks corner, and now we continue onwards and upwards towards the right hand corner, which is slightly tighter, at the gooseneck. Another good spectator vantage point on the outside of the corner. Guthrie's Memorial on the right, but in the words of the old poet, no time to stand and stare. Stewart safely negotiates the veranda and heads for the railway crossing at the bungalow, under the footbridge and on up the hill. Halewoods Rise. The very aptly named Windy Corner next. The road may have been resurfaced and the corner redesigned, but the wind is still there to be contended with. Capelgate and Kate's Cottage at the top of the hill, and then the frightening run down to Cregny Bar. No stop for a pint. For Stewart, it's round the right hand bend and on down to Brandish, another of the redesigned corners. After negotiating Brandish Corner, which is a wide left-hand bend, it's on down to Hillbury, which is a sweeping right-hand bend with a slight climb, climbing up towards Signpost Corner, and then the end really is in sight. This is Signpost Corner, and then it's on down to Governor's Bridge using the old road, which is still part of the circuit, and the new road for the purpose of this parade was still barred. So the rallyists had the opportunity to go right down into Governor's Dip, come out into the sunlight and dash towards the finishing line and the checkered flag. Stewart sensibly makes no mistake. Many a TT and Manx Grand Prix rider has come to grief in this innocuous little loop in the road. Well, there's the checkered flag, and I think, if my calculations are correct, Stewart's time was 35 minutes 22 seconds for the 37.5 mile course, which ain't bad. Half the speed of John McGuinness. I'd do it all again, said Stewart, and I reckon he would as well. Stewart gave me the bare bones of the little story which is to follow, and I guess that's very typical of Vincent ownership, where the bike effectively becomes part of the family and is treated as such. In anticipation for the all clear to go out onto the circuit proper, much twitching and turning and adjusting and wondering, but they will all soon know what it's like to approach the top of Bray Hill. Stewart says his dad was fascinated by all things mechanical, and as a teenager and as a young man worked his way through a number of motorcycles and even a Morgan three-wheeler before finally owning the Comet in the photograph. It completed over 250,000 miles and was detailed in Motorcycling on April the 30th, 1953. So began the family connection with the Vincent HRD mark. This picture is of Stewart's father John grass tracking his Series A Comet, grass tracking being a popular pastime for men, young and old alike, in the 40s and 50s. They would often ride their bike to the event, maybe take off the lights and then compete, fit the lights again and ride home. I've certainly seen that done myself in the racing at Cassacoombe in the 1950s. John built a single adult sidecar which he attached to the Comet so that he and his young wife Joan could share the interest. Joan apparently sat on the floor of their first house. He drew round her with chalk, and that's how the pattern for the sidecar base was conceived. Then there was a break in the Metcalfe family connection with motorcycles as John bought his first car, an ex-Glasgow police Alvis Firefly, and began to travel the UK, developing his reputation and career as an emerging engineer. Along came Joan and John's first son Andrew, and then, in 1963, Stuart. In the early 70s, John went to Knockhill race circuit to fill in a weekend, and there he met the late Ian Hamilton, who was racing his superb Egley twin. About much has been written in MPH over the years, and the interest in motorcycles, particularly in Vincent's, was rekindled. Some few months later, through the membership of the VOC and the Scottish section, John and Stuart met Tam Morton, pictured here in 1958, the third owner of a Series C Rapide, which had first been registered KWS 100 a year after manufacture, and it was registered and sold through Alexander's in Edinburgh in September 1953. The original owner of the bike had been a lawyer, the second owner was a bookmaker, and the third was Tam, who was a railwayman and had owned the Vincent since the late 50s. Sadly, the bike had been stripped for restoration and was found in his shed in large lumps. Nevertheless, thus began a friendship with Tam, and the Vincent soon arrived at John and Stuart's home, where John set about the restoration, assisted by Stuart, who by then was aged 12. Tam loved the old Vincent and would often travel the 20 miles to Stuart's home on a Saturday to sit, have a cigarette, and watch the Vincent restoration as it progressed. Indeed, it was one such Saturday whilst Stuart's mum and dad were out shopping that he encouraged the 13-year-old to get the Vincent out of the garage and taught him the starting technique. Ease it over compression, and then with a gentle full swing without the decompression lever, kick, and the bike fired and ran. So now we've got a new image. This is young Stuart, age 14, with KWS 100 in Hamilton in Scotland. And now a photograph of a slightly older Stuart, wearing his dad's battle bowler, as he calls it, imagining he was travelling at speed, which indeed he was in the film you saw earlier. Well, life tends to have its ups and downs, and in 1986 the family's money was tighter, and through the good offices of Ted Davis, whose photograph is seen here, the Vincent was sold to a gentleman in Australia. That could so easily have been the end of the story. But in 2005, Stuart's dad called one evening to say that he'd found the original buff logbook for the Vincent and a book of petrol rationing coupons. John and Stuart both thought that the paperwork deserved to be with the bike, and through the help of the club records, Stuart was put in touch with Brian Shaw, who, it transpired, was the third owner of the Vincent in Australia and had only owned the bike for a year. Over the next couple of years, Stuart and Brian swapped photographs and stories from the past and from the present as the Vincent restoration in Australia neared completion. Stuart joked with Brian that should he ever wish to part with the Vincent, then Stuart would love first refusal. Never expecting to get such a message, but to his delight, he opened an email in 2006 from Brian that said, "Mate, she's yours. Send beer vouchers." Brian had been suffering from ill health, and his doctors had advised a lighter motorcycle. So, with family support, Stuart was able to buy the Vincent and arrange for it to be shipped. Here's the photograph of the bike being collected from Brian's daughter's house in Sydney by the shipping agent, and 6 weeks later Stuart was uncrating the bike in Brentwood, outside the bonded warehouse. Sadly, during Ted Davis's dealings with his Australian customer, the motorcycle and its registration number KWS 100 had become separated, and Stuart has been unable to track it down. So, following a wash and polish and a visit to the local DVLA office, the bike assumed a new identity as 824XUE, and the story continues. And here she poses for the photographer outside one of Buckinghamshire's stately homes, and then we see her being ridden by Stuart at the Festival of 1,000 Bikes in 2007, shortly after it returned from its 25 years in Australia. Some would say this is a familiar sight of a Vincent in bits, requiring substantial surgery, and certainly Stuart was in that situation 6 weeks before his trip to the Manx Grand Prix in 2008. Luckily, his guardian angel, in the guise of a famous local Vincent engine builder, came to his rescue and stripped, repaired and rebuilt the engine in time for Stuart to test the bike before taking it to the 2008 Manx on time. And it was during that visit that he had the good fortune to book bed and breakfast with Tony and Pat at the Kirkmichael Old Rectory, where the ARE collection of motorcycles is housed, and where a new friendship and a new base for the annual pilgrimage to the Isle of Man was established. Stuart has now completed over 12,500 miles on the bike, and with the friendship and assistance of local section members, including Paul Packman, who rebuilt his clutch and supplied and fitted the stunning twin leading shoe brake conversion, and the ever helpful Russ Kemp of Vin Parts, the bike is well run in and is proved thoroughly reliable, recently competing 800 miles over 4 days to the Loire Valley and the French section VOC rally, which has been written up in MPH recently. Slightly more up to date now, with a couple of shots which I took at last year's Derby Festival of Stuart wearing down his footrests on the corner there, and finally the photograph taken by Brian Neal at Quarter Bridge in this year's lap. And there we have the full story, Stuart's steed.